Hi, today I'd like to talk a little bit about both the role of the director and the producer. Now, I've uploaded a PowerPoint that sort of highlights all of these elements that our textbook emphasizes about the director as well as the producer, but I'm going to kind of try to expand on some of these ideas. So the first thing is to think about the role of the director. We've already looked at the actor, and next week we'll look at the playwright, but the director is sort of in charge of the entire production. Now, after the playwright's the first person to come in contact with the play. The next person to come in contact, usually with the script, is the director. And the director works closely with stage managers, both rehearsal stage managers, production stage managers, and then what we call performance stage managers. The director also works with all of the designers, so the set designer, lighting designer, costume designer, projection designer, sound designer, makeup, hair designer. And ultimately the director coordinates the work of all of these designers. Now, what the producer does is the producer actually oversees the role of all of the business elements. So the producer might manage the theater, the show personnel, all the contracts, everything from the contracts with the director to stage manager to the actors to all of the personnel backstage. So the producer really is sort of the head of the business side. Of course, this is different with film, and I want to emphasize that, theater's model is quite different than film. But even within theater, there are different models because we have for-profit theater, usually what we think of, say, Broadway. And then we have regional theater, which is professional, but typically it's nonprofit. Then we have small nonprofit theaters. We might even have experimental theaters, and then educational theater, and then subsets of that in terms of like children's theater, youth theater, and other kinds of community-based theater. So getting back to the director. So the director, as our text sort of points out, evolved from more of a company leader position. If we look back to the Greeks, in a way, the playwright sort of functioned as a director because they staged their works in ancient Greek times. They were selected to produce the plays, and then they would have sponsors, somewhat like a producer, and raise money to produce their plays. So they would be actually writing their own play and then overseeing it. So they were sort of like a company manager. Some argue that a German director was the first director in the 19th century, but really, if we look back, everything from Molière to even Shakespeare's time to the Greeks, this company manager, head of the production, functioned very similarly to what we call a director today. And ultimately, the director unifies the style of the play by developing a concept, a central concept of how the play is going to be staged, that also leads the designers to formulate their own ideas. And then the director also thinks about the social behavior of the characters and then its relationship to society, both when the play was written and when the play is being performed. In other words, how that particular play that the director is working on might be relevant to an audience today. And as I mentioned before, the director is the sort of usually the second person to come in contact with the play after the playwright, him or herself. The director really has to identify what the spine of the play is about. So the spine is this sort of thing that carries through from beginning to end. If you think about what a spine is in your own body, it holds you upright. It sort of connects all the parts of you together. And so, in a sense, that's what the spine of a play does. And this concept of the spine was first theorized by the theater critic and educator Harold Clurman, and he wrote specifically about this idea that the spine is this general action that motivates the entire play. So some might call it the fundamental conflict or drama that sort of everything hinges on, or the main action. And in a sense, every character is seeking the same goal from the director's perspective. So not from the actor's perspective, because many times actors work quite differently in thinking about their characters than what the director might see. And usually that's okay, because the director has this overarching vision that ties and pulls everything together. So if you think about, we're looking at A Midsummer Night's Dream, and how there are so many different ways that play has been staged. Now, the playwright wrote one instance of it, but the multiple productions that interpret it, and even interpret different spines of the play. Same thing could be true for, say, something like Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet, or really any play. The director thinks about, what is this play about? And then that sort of motivates the director to make choices about blocking, to make choices about style, and to make choices to apply concept to the play itself. So the director finds this style for the production, and with Shakespeare, directors stylize or conceptualize Shakespeare's plays quite often. But our book identifies that this should not be gimmicky, because many times it's really easy to lay a concept onto a play and then it actually doesn't serve the play itself. So it actually goes against what the playwright's message really is about. And so as a director, it's important to know where that line is and to understand that applying a concept onto a play doesn't always work, and that sometimes stepping back and revisiting what the playwright's really intention is as important as making a play relevant for contemporary audiences. Obviously, the director has to identify whether or not the play is based in realism, or what sort of level of realism, whether that means naturalism or heightened realism, or if there's moments of non-realism, such as expressionism and allegory, or even postmodernism. So all of these elements the director is kind of working out. So as the director figures out style, the director also develops this concept. And your discussion question for this week, if you choose to do the part that asks you about concept, is to think about what kind of controlling idea or metaphor or image, central image, vision, point of view, could you use if you were thinking about directing the play A Midsummer Night's Dream. So this concept needs to unify the entire theatrical experience for spectators. So one of the examples I could give is I co-directed a production of Macbeth at Chaffee with Kelly Ford Kaminsky, and I think our concept was sort of twofold. We were interested in this idea of both the cave, or a sort of thickness and darkness that could extend off the stage, so that we felt a sort of medieval darkness. So this idea of the Dark Ages, but also drawing from contemporary examples of things like Game of Thrones, where we were sort of hyper texturizing everything through the use of stone and roughness and dirt and thickness of air, as well as the quality of costume. So these tactile references were what we were reaching for, both visually but also for the actors to connect with. Musically, I worked quite a bit on the music and sound, and so conceptually I was interested in this idea of the sound working as not just a heartbeat underneath everything, but these sort of natural natural instruments that could be plucked or pulled or hit or struck or tapped, and that the witches would create this soundscape underneath to envelop the audience in. So that was sort of a concept for Macbeth that we did at Chaffey College. So what is a central image? Well, a central image, as we've looked a little bit at what symbol and metaphor is, and usually a director looks to a sort of metaphor to help describe what this controlling or central idea is, so that it would serve the spirit of the play as well as serve the meaning of the play. And so a central image or metaphor for something like Macbeth was the snake eating its own tail, right? So here's this image of a snake devouring itself through a sort of narcissism, but almost through compulsion. And so that was a metaphor that we were using to thinking about Macbeth and everybody else surrounding him. For Midsummer Night's Dream, thinking about a concept or a central image. So after you read the play or you watch the video, this is something that you could think about. What kind of metaphor might serve the play that you could sort of hang your hat on as a concept if you were directing it? So think about that. So another element that connects to the director is the dramaturge or literary manager. So this is a position that is relatively new, in the sense that it's only been a couple hundred years that the dramaturge has been around, but this particular person researches the script for the director, for the actors, for even educational outreach. And the dramaturge, and the subject is called dramaturgy, but the dramaturge actually will research reviews of previous productions, or look at how has the play been interpreted in the past, and then also even through criticism, meaning scholarship, that they might read scholarly articles, the way in which people look at that particular play. So for some theaters, especially regional, professional, and even Broadway, a dramaturge is usually used so that the director has that kind of access to that research, which can be very important for getting things right, but also for understanding how this particular production might be interpreting the play in its own way. So that's the role of the dramaturge. Where do directors come from? Or how do you become a director? Usually directors are actors who maybe for whatever reason are not as interested in acting, or just are able to envision the production more wholly as a sort of third eye. There is specialty training, so most large universities have MFA programs in directing. Even at Chaffey, we offer several courses in directing. And this person needs to obviously work well with all sorts of people, because they're interfacing with the actors through rehearsal. The stage manager is their sort of right-hand person. And then they also have to work with all of the designers and then the production staff, because ultimately the show has to get mounted. The director coordinates all of that creativity between the designers. And there's a lot of egos involved, having been in both worlds, both as a director and a designer. The director researches the play, and then the director also usually pre-plans or blocks scenes and has ideas in terms of where people move at what points, and this all gets coordinated with the set designer as well as the stage manager. Sometimes directors use a more organic approach where they work with the actors in the moment, instead of pre-blocking everything, but working with an actor to see what feels right for a scene. And then typically a lot of directors use a combination where you pre-block. Blocking is where actors move. So stage directions are where they move to, like downstage left, downstage right, and then blocking is that choreography, that element that the director usually choreographs where the actor moves, and then the stage manager notates it in his or her script. So a director might use a combination of pre-blocking and organic blocking. And blocking, of course, is essential to this idea of movement, but also motivation and conflict, because you're telling the story visually through blocking. So the director creates the movement of the entire play by setting the pace and the rhythm, and also unifying all of the ideas. And then one other type of director I want to kind of talk about is the auteur director. So auteur is a French word, and it means author. But this is a director who kind of controls all aspects of the production and might even interpret the script and adapt it in certain ways, or base the production on a script. And we've already encountered this with A Doll's House by Mabou Mines, directed by Lee Brewer, who is an auteur director. I also posted clips of Peter Brook's groundbreaking production of A Midsummer Night's Dream from 1970, also an auteur director. So an auteur director is someone who is really sort of influencing through their directorial concept, but they might shift and shape the script differently, and they're really controlling this whole picture of even down to the minute movement of what an actor does. So there's a little less what I might call free choice in what the actor is doing. Particular directors who are quite famous for this are Robert Wilson, who's a postmodern director, and some of the images in the PowerPoint are Robert Wilson productions. Richard Foreman, who is a director and the head of a theater in New York called the Ontological Theater. I worked with Richard Foreman many years ago during a summer gig in the Berkshires. Most of his work is usually about mental illness and sort of science and the genius of the scientist. And then other auteur directors, Grotowski, who came out of the 1960s, Poland, who was really experimenting with breaking down what theater is and not producing theater in sort of a normative theatrical space with all of the suspension of disbelief and illusion, but looking at what the actor's doing and the fundamentals of performance. So all of those artists are definitely considered auteur directors, including a Russian artist, Meyerhold, who was a contemporary of Stanislavski's, who came out of more of a, I don't want to call it surrealism, but who broke away from realism in Russia and developed his own biomechanics. He was really interested in form and shape, these sort of formal elements of what theater could be, and developed a whole other way of moving and expressing the text. So that's what auteur director. So some of the key terms that I've already sort of covered are the spine of the play, the auteur director, directorial concept, blocking, casting. Well, so casting is when somebody auditions for a play and the director chooses who is going to play that role. That's called casting. So typecasting means that you cast someone who looks, sounds like the part. And then casting against type is when you cast someone who may not be a certain gender or ethnicity or size, and you cast them in the role anyway, and they bring something completely different to the part. So casting against the type, that's what that means. Obviously, I already mentioned audition. So in audition, we don't use the term tryout because tryouts are typically used for like competitions, but audition is what we use in theater. And then rehearsal, we use the term rehearsal in that process of preparing and repeating scenes and going through scenes with the director and the stage manager. And then during, usually a week before the show opens is called a technical rehearsals or tech week. Some people call it Hell Week because it is particularly grueling. And then usually as a part of that is the cue to cue. And that simply means that we move from each type of cue, meaning it's a lighting cue or a sound cue or a set change, or a costume change, and we don't actually run the scenes, but we're trying to work out all of those transitions technically, so that the crew and the stage manager and all the technical elements can sort of rehearse the moments that they need to prepare for. Then we go back and rehearse all of that with all the technical elements with full costumes, and we call that a dress rehearsal. And then a preview is usually a performance that is still sort of considered not quite a rehearsal, but that we're ready to show it to an audience, and maybe it's a special audience or an invited audience, but it's really a preview of the production before it opens to the general public. So that's what a preview is. All right, so what is, or who is the producer? So in nonprofit theater, we don't typically see a producer that often, and mainly because the producer really is quite connected to this idea of running the theater as a business and securing funding through all kinds of means. And in nonprofit world, that usually happens through grant writing and through development, audience development, as well as fundraising. And so typically you have a person who's in charge of that in the nonprofit, but you don't call them a producer. They're usually a development director. So in the for-profit world, we have this person who is the producer, who is managing the business. And if you ever want a little more information about the producer, watch either the film The Producers, Mel Brooks, or the Broadway musical. It's hysterical about what producers do to get a show on stage on Broadway, because they have to raise a lot of money. They finance the production, and they have to secure the rights for the script. They deal with all of the different agents, either for the playwright, the actors, and then they deal with all of those contracts. They hire everybody associated with that production, and that means that then they have to interface with unions if it's on Broadway, or even if it's off Broadway but is an equity house. So an equity house means that they use union actors. And then they have to secure a space. So the producer has to then, book that space, and shows get booked way in advance in terms of going to Broadway. So a lot of producers end up taking shows to LA or Chicago to test the show first, or to develop it before it ever moves to New York. They might even supervise how the theater is running, meaning the box office, front of house. Anything that happens not on stage or backstage is called front of house. So that includes the auditorium, the box office, and business office. So the producer might supervise all of that. They might even have control or responsibility for all the advertising, because that impacts the budget. So really they manage all of the financial aspects of the production. So that's really what the producer does. So in nonprofit, a different model is that we have usually an executive director who sort of oversees the entire theater, maybe visioning what the theater is doing, what it's going to do. And then we have sometimes a managing director. And that managing director really functions like a business manager. We might have a theater manager, but typically for a nonprofit, it's the managing director. And then we might have an artistic director. And that artistic director might just simply be someone who directs some of the productions, but also selects the season with other help, or is a little more in control of the kinds of plays that a particular theater does, or the kinds of playwrights that they might work with to help develop new works, that kind of thing. And then the nonprofit, just because of by law, you have to have a board of directors. And so typically a board of directors consists of people who are prominent in the community, who might be able to help fundraise. So lawyers, doctors, just well-to-do people. But some nonprofits actually don't use a board of directors that way, but might actually use the board of directors as more of what's called a working board. And so they might have certain skill sets that they bring to the table for that organization. So I've seen different kinds of models in terms of how the board of directors interface with the actual institution. So some of the key terms from this chapter that sort of expand on the types of theaters and the kinds of roles have to do with unions. So we have equity, which is the actors union. We have IATSE, which is the stagehands union. We have the Artists Guild, which is the set designers union. We have terms like for-profit versus non-profit. So non-profit status can sometimes be called 501c3 status, and that's just an IRS designation. This idea that nonprofits, they raise money through writing grants, and then versus a for-profit that raises money through producing, for having other producers come on to a show. So a repertory theater is a theater that might have certain shows that they run in rep. So they might have 3 shows that run during a month and they change over. So like for 2 days this show runs, and then for the following weekend a new show runs. And so that's where that term repertory comes from. We don't have a lot of rep theaters left in this country. It used to be quite popular. I think La Jolla might have in San Diego a rep theater, and then American Repertory Theater, which is connected with Harvard University in Cambridge, and then Yale Rep, which obviously is connected with Yale University, and San Jose used to have a repertory theater, but they closed. I'm trying to think of a couple of others, but anyway, when we say that there's a repertory theater, it both designates a kind of theater as well as how they produce shows, and it also typically means professional, that they usually either have equity contracts or even an acting staff on hand that are a company. So the difference between non-union house and a union house is a union house usually has to use equity actors as well as IATSE stagehands, and a non-union house, they don't necessarily have to hire. They hire people who are non-union or do special contracts with equity. So those are some of the key terms that kind of hit from our book. I think LORT B is the last one, League of Regional Theaters, certain size of theater. So regional theaters could be anything from Arena Stage to, trying to think of Mill Mountain Theater in Roanoke, Virginia, to some of the Shakespeare festivals. So it has a designation, but also it means what kind of budget that particular theater has. So they're a part of that league. So those are some of the ways in which theater companies operate. So that's about it for this little section on directors and producers. And our the next thing I'll talk about specifically has to do with Shakespeare and his language. All right, see you soon.